Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Mark Turi, and if you haven't already, please give this video a like and please subscribe. I have been very happy because the past couple of weeks I've gained close to 500 subscribers, and I've been posting my videos on different places and I got a couple thousand views, more views of my or I should say mine, we're in this community. The video that I did on the Twilight Zone, if you remember, from a couple months ago. I did my top six favorite episodes of the Twilight Zone and honorable mentions. And I think that's over 3,000 views right now, which I think is amazing. So I'm slowly inching and crawling my way towards monetization. Cross your fingers for me. Uh, and that would be great. Hopefully can get that in, quite soon, at least hopefully the next few months, if not by the end of the year. But yeah, please welcome to my channel. Like the video, subscribe, tell your friends. And of course, I do want to mention, which I will mention later on, because when more people come into the live. Last week, I do apologize to everyone. I had a very mild cold over the like I guess maybe a week ago. Maybe 10 days ago, I caught like a little bit of one. I was very, very stuffed up. My throat was a little hoarse and dry. And Saturday and Sunday of last week, when I woke up, I had laryngitis. I actually couldn't talk. And so I thought, well, I don't know sign language, and I don't think I'm going to be able to pantomime my way or mime my way through, an hour. So unfortunately, I had to cancel, but everyone seemed to wish me well, which I am much better. After Wednesday of last week, I started feeling a lot better, and now I'm here. So I thank everyone for their patience. I will say again, and I will let everyone know after the fact when we make the conclusion of what we're talking about today, that I may have another schedule change next week. I'm hope to be, or at least planning to be, out of town. So I will let you know if or not there will be another live 1 week from today. However, the good news is you won't be without content because during this week, and I'm going to schedule it and let everyone know on my community tab, I will be doing a collaboration with Marilyn Honig again from Coffee Cults and Crafts. And we're going to be doing a history of Judaism and a history of Christianity and looking into some of the different things about that. So you also might remember a few months ago, I did a video, one of my uh, favorite video I think I've done on the channel. Not to say that I haven't loved all of them, but I do have a favorite. But my personal favorite was the one I did on the Jewish denominations and ethnic divisions, which I think I did, last fall, October, November, somewhere around there. And I'm really proud of that one. I really enjoyed that. So I'm going to take some of that information that we discussed in that video, and we're going to do, I think, probably more than one video with Marilyn. And Marilyn is great. If you are not subscribed to her channel, it's Coffee Cults and Crafts, Marilyn Honig. So that will be out sometime this week, unless, of course, there's a schedule change. But we are, getting the times and the days down right now, so it should be this week. So I will let you all know if I'm going to be available next Sunday. If I'm not, you'll know. I will send a message. However, there'll definitely be content at least during the week, next week, and even perhaps afterwards, because I think Marilyn wants to do more than one video. So we'll just let you know the schedules after that. So again, this video I was going to do a couple weeks ago. Of course, we had the thing with the with the vote, which I am going to, as I mentioned last time we chatted 2 weeks ago, I'm going to be more diligent on um, checking to see who wins the vote. This did win the vote from a couple weeks ago, but we talked about religious and secular humanism, which I was very happy with that. I hope you all enjoyed that again. I hope you enjoy all of my videos. And that was a real interesting one, just because I don't know how many people who even consider themselves humanists who actually know what religious humanism is and what the history actually is, which is kind of bizarre. I don't know, maybe because I'm a historian, I think this way. Maybe some people just don't care because they're happy with their beliefs, and that to me is awesome. I think that's actually really good. But I don't know, maybe just my historian brain is like, wouldn't you want to know what the history is anyway? Doesn't matter. And so I'm hoping that that one went well. It did pretty good. And yeah, I'm hoping that you also enjoy this one simply for the fact that most of you all voted for this 2 weeks ago, and I just didn't see it when I checked in and made the link in the thumbnail 2 weeks ago. Um, a little sort of small talk house cleaning in the past 2 weeks. What have I been doing? Writing again. You all know I have a thesis due in April. Um, I've been doing some applications for PhD programs, and yeah, just learning. I learn Spanish. I do 2 to 3 hours of Spanish every week. I'm getting better at that. I've been posting some videos of myself reading, short stories and stuff online, and I think I'm doing pretty good in there. And what else? I mean, it's been anywhere from 0 to 5 degrees. I know in Canada, my family said that there's a polar vortex, so it's been 10 degrees below zero, 20 degrees below zero, which is just horrific. But it has been very windy here, and the wind has been quite cold. Um, it was Groundhog Day, and the groundhog apparently we're going to have 6 more weeks of winter. If that's a thing, I have no idea. I also love that movie. um, and yeah, I am going to move forward on doing a PowerPoint because I want to do a PowerPoint on the last week of February, which will be February 23rd, and 2 weeks from now. And I'd like to do one on, yeah, on my favorite episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation, considering that my Twilight Zone episode now has, or Twilight Zone live has, more than 3,000 views, which for me is a lot. Um, and so I'm very happy about that. And the only other thing is that I've been watching a lot of movies, so I can do a bit of a small movies, new release movies. If you want to know, I watched a whole ton of movies, and one of which I just got finished. I think about a half an hour ago, or maybe 45 minutes ago, called Conclave, which stars Ray Fiennes, Jonathan Lithgow, and Isabella Rossellini, and it's of course about a fictional conclave in the Catholic Church when a pope dies, and then they have to elect another pope. And I loved it. So this kind of connects to a little bit connects to our biblical criticism versus biblical literalism debate. I don't know much. I don't know much about the Catholic Church or how they elect popes or anything. I just know they elect the pope, and then if there's white smoke that comes out of a chimney in the Vatican, uh, you know, they got a pope. But I really enjoyed Conclave. I thought it was really a great movie and really great performances. Both Ray Fiennes and John Lithgow are like probably two of my top 5, 10, favorite, male actors working today. And especially as I was a kid, John Lithgow was in Harry and the Hendersons. I know him from that. He went on to Dexter, was so good in that show. Fourth season, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, Blowout. He's hosted Saturday Night Live, I remember, in the late 1980s, and was really great. And then Ray Fiennes, of course, in Schindler's List is just one of the the worst, most disgusting villains of all time. And he was also in another film called Sunshine, which was about a Hungarian Jewish family, which is a personal favorite of mine. But anyway, I recommend Conclave. I don't know if you are Catholic. I have no idea if it how accurate it is, or the ending might be a little bit, if you are Catholic. But not being one, being an outsider, and just having been a tourist inside a number of cathedrals all around the world, I enjoyed it. I'm kind of ignorant, but I did enjoy it. Peter Anderson, how are you? Mark Postle, number 4, reporting. Well, I see you, number 4, and I'm very, very happy that you are here to talk about biblical criticism versus biblical literalism. And yeah, other than that, I think we'll get into the topic of what we're going to discuss today. Um, I am glad that this won the topic a couple weeks ago. Again, I didn't see it until a day after, when this topic won, and the other topic I did on humanism didn't win. But I just think it's a very interesting issue, and an interesting kind of intersection between these two different ideas on how uh, clergy people and parishioners, scholars, theologians, biologists, archaeologists, historians, etc., look at stories, human stories, and especially ones that are inside of sacred scriptures and sacred texts. And yes, I thank you very, very much, Peter, for doing that. Yeah, I think you were like the last one to vote, which shifted, I think, a little bit anyway. um, and yeah, I talked about this issue a few months ago with Marilyn, who again I will be talking to again this week. So please go on to her channel and subscribe so you can check out what we're going to do, this week, this upcoming week. And I felt it was a very interesting issue. So biblical criticism and literalism, it's pretty much uh, kind of an easy definition, but I sort of wanted to get into more of the nitty gritty. So if we're going to define what biblical criticism is, it really is relatively new, I guess, within the maybe the past 100 or 200 years. And certainly it's been quite more popular in academia, probably since at least the 60s. So it in of itself is a form of literary criticism, which again is kind of like, um, you know, uh, uh, a sort of a cultural history, sort of using what academia has at its disposal. So using anthropology, archaeology, history, literary criticism, and even science and stuff like this to analyze, specifically in this case the Bible, but also other non-Christian or non-Jewish, non-Muslims sacred texts. So it's not just about, in the Christian world, of course, you have the Bible, which you have these two books, the Old Testament and the New Testament. In Judaism, we have the what you would call the Old Testament, we call the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. And then, we don't have the New Testament for theological reasons. And then, of course, in Islam, they have the Bible plus of the Old and New Testament. We also, by the way, in the Jewish world, would actually call the New Testament the Christian Bible, but regardless. And then they have the Quran. So there's obviously a lot of history in those pages, and there's a lot of questions as to, you know, um, how people interpreted those scriptures, those stories, that are in all of these texts. And so, just before I mention that, I just want to say I can watch, but I've been banned. Oh, okay. That's too bad, Peter. And hey, Irish Mark, good to see you. Always good to see you on here. As I mentioned every week, you are one of our exalted Mark apostles. I'm going to say you're number three. I want to say you're number three. Yeah, you are number three, as Peter says. So I've got three and four here. I appreciate that very much. And so I'm just discussing a little bit about biblical criticism. It's again, it's looking at the Bible. It's looking at what we refer to as the Bible, the Jewish part of the Bible, the Christian interpretation, and the Muslim interpretation, and using academia in all of its forms, from humanities, natural sciences, and social sciences, to sort of figure out, in some ways, whether what is historically accurate in one context versus what would be metaphorical in another aspect, versus all these different kinds of things. And so that's really what biblical criticism is. And the very broad general definition of literalism is that it kind of goes back no more than about 300 years, which I know sounds very strange for a lot of people, but no more than 300 years ago, there was the scientific revolution. Before that, there's not much evidence to say that all Christians, whether they were Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox or other like the Hussites or whatever, and that's from Jan Hus, who's like really the first Protestant, and then he was killed. So then they have the Second Reformation with Luther. But regardless, the idea that it's always been literal, that the Bible has been always been 100% literal. I just want to say hi to Black Boots. Sorry, I didn't see you there, Black Boots. My mistake. I hope you're doing well. It's good to see you. Hello from New York. I hope it's not too cold there. Um, but literalism just means you take the Bible literally. And certainly in certain communities, I would say in the United States, particularly in the Bible Belt, there's been a very influential kind of evangelical or fundamentalist kind of Protestant view of interpreting scripture literally. So going back to the book of Genesis, we may have, for example, young earth creationists, which again is not more than 300 years old. It's a very specific Protestant movement in the evangelical community that more than likely would have started in the what would today we would call the United Kingdom and Ireland, predominantly, of course, Catholic or Anglican areas, or in Scotland, mostly Presbyterian, but they had a very conservative, very literalistic interpretation of the Bible. And then many of them ended up in America, where they were allowed to sort of isolate their communities in some ways. And then, throughout the years, especially throughout the Discovery Revolution and so forth, they started to take more hardline stances on things like young earth creationism. And then, that also influences public policy and education policy, such as around 20 years ago, Dover, I think it was called the in Dover, Pennsylvania, Dover County, Pennsylvania. There was a few high schools that wanted to make intelligent design and textbooks that preached intelligent design part of science classes, and there were lawsuits and stuff. So this is a lot of where a lot of the things in the United States. It's also not just the US. I know that it goes on all over the world. It's just mostly popularized in the US because it's such a big country, and there's also a lot of people who live in the US. So when there is, there's a lot more evangelical Protestantism in the United States, surely by number of organizations, and then they have a lot of power and influence in politics as well, to some extent. It definitely depends on the state, but certainly in the South. And so literalism would be something like the story happened, and so even if it contradicts, like even if natural sciences and cosmology and astrophysics and whatever contradict a statement like evolution or the age of the earth, where we get to the Copernicus and that kind of thing. that you always go by what scripture says. And this is why in the United States, there's a creationist museum in Kentucky where, I mean, there are they actually depict cavemen or early, what should be, early Homo sapiens who are living side by side with dinosaurs, which of course is not every Christian would believe that. I know many who don't. I know the Catholic Church doesn't. At least the official Roman Catholic Church doesn't. I know a number of more mainline churches don't as well. And even in Judaism, that's very strange for us because when I loop back into biblical criticism, I'll give some more context. But the idea of dinosaurs and humans, they did not live by side. Um, you know what I mean? The literal ark. There's also, I think, on the same museum or either the same on the grounds of that museum, of the Creation Museum, or I think it's also in Kentucky. It's one of these two things where there's an Ark museum. So someone had actually built, or a group of people had built what they would consider Noah's Ark. And it's like literally, there was literally two of every animal. The flood was literally worldwide. But then we have questions to those things, and I can get into some of them also in a moment when we discuss biblical criticism. So that's really the basic line, right? Like, okay, if we look at biblical criticism, we're just thinking like, okay, what were the actual purposes of these stories? If they're allegories, why are they allegories? Did people in ancient times assume we have to assume, of course, that these things were written by people, whether we think those people were divinely inspired or it was revelation or they just created it, that doesn't necessarily matter. Human beings ultimately wrote these things down. So what did they believe at the time? What did they know at the time? What was available to them at the time, and so on. So to me, it's a much like biblical criticism, which I like, is just a much bigger, more academic, more wholesome or holistic type of study. I find biblical literalism just to be like, well, the words say it's so, and therefore it's so. Not to say, by the way, that there aren't intellectuals, because there are many private Christian schools, not just in the United States, in Canada and elsewhere, where evangelicals have created universities. So they are themselves, like in their own, on their campuses, doing scholarly work. They just happen to interpret it in a biblical literalistic way, which can often come in conflict with, um, like public education, especially post secondary education. And so, again, I'm not trying to say one is intellectual and one is anti intellectual. That isn't true. But for me personally, just by my own preferences, plus the fact that young earth creationism is very Christian, it may be Muslim, but it's very Christian. I'm not an evangelical Protestant. I'm part of the traditional or Masorti Jewish movement. So it's just a different interpretation. To get a little bit now more into the nitty gritty about specific stories and analyzing and stuff, I'll loop back to biblical criticism. And sort of again, one of the reasons why I like biblical criticism is because it has actually been very much accepted by a lot of religious people. So if there is an idea of anybody here that's like, well, all Christians believe in literalism, or they all take it literally, that's not true. It's the same with in any religion. Like, you can be a part of any religion. And yeah, there are some people who will take that sacred text, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita, or the Dharmapada, or the Bible, the Quran, the Torah. There's lots of scriptures out there, and sure, some groups will take those things literally, but other groups won't. And the idea of religion, being monolithic and making like monolithic choices on how to interpret scripture is not the case. Meaning that one, there's like, a third of the population on earth is Christian. They're not all seeing the Bible in the same way. And in fact, I think probably, even though there might be a lot of influence in certain parts of the US, in the English speaking world, and perhaps even in the Latin American world, who may take it literally, Overall, it's probably not, not the case that most Christians or every Christian would believe that. And I think that's interesting. So, from a biblical criticism standpoint, the idea is just, if we take a story, and I always like to do Noah's Ark because most people um, know Noah's Ark. It's a pretty basic story that a lot of children are taught Sunday school. I want to first say I know some of you may have gone to Sunday school in whatever church you grew up in on Sundays and may have attended mass or services. If we have anyone who's part of another religion, like if you're Jewish, you might have gone to Hebrew school. I did not. My parents were very liberal in their religion and what you might call nominal. So their religious practice was a couple times a year, if. And my grandparents, I think I had one grandparent that later in life was more religious, but my other grandparents weren't. So I never went to church on Sunday. We never did synagogue on Friday. I also have Jewish and Christian family. So we were not strongly observant in that way. And I never went to Sunday school or Hebrew school. I've said this before. I mostly developed my religiosity as an adult and was encouraged by my parents, which gave me an identity crisis, certainly in my late teens and 20s. But now that I'm in my 40s, I actually find that to be kind of refreshing and in the long run, just personally positive. Obviously, no judgment to anyone who had a different childhood or is a parent and different choices. That's just my one perspective. But if we take something like the ark, right? So a biblical literalist will say, yes, there was an ark, there was a Noah. Noah literally built a massive ark, which is a boat, essentially, and because there was an actual worldwide flood. Okay, um, right? So that's pretty I mean, there's more to the story than that, but let's just use that, okay? And Noah literally brought two of every animal, we would assume one male and one female, of every single animal species on Earth, not just what was in his vicinity, which would have been in the Middle East, right? But everyone that was available at the time onto the ark and so forth. The biblical critic, right? The people who believe in biblical criticism will go, okay, but how would that work? Well, first of all, the first question not only would be how would that work. First question would be, um, did the people who wrote this story, what did they actually like believe about this story? So is there any evidence that those that may have written and contributed to the story, as well, by the way, as everything is spoken first. It was the Torah, and a lot of those stories, like Noah, were oral traditions, right? Just like many other communities have oral traditions all over the world. So these were stories that were passed around through people, and eventually they were written down into scrolls and so forth. And this happened after the Romans destroyed the temple. This really was a concerted effort to have Jewish scribe, so transcribe these stories from mouth to mouth. Because we know this, all there, um, I would say, um, personally, okay, that there would be some kind of error, and this is where biblical criticism says, like, so we have to start by saying, would the people telling these stories, would the people who wrote these stories think of them as literal? The safe answer is sure, some of them might have been, but then there's no actual evidence that the Bible was taken 100% literally, really until that post-scientific revolution movement of, as I mentioned, 250, 300 years ago. So what would it be then? Well, it would be an allegory, and then we have to find the meaning behind the allegory, which becomes more complicated because it becomes more subjective. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just looking at it from a logistical standpoint of like how big would that ark would have been if we have two of every single animal, then there's got to be both predators, carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, predators and prey. If they're wild animals that can't be trained, how do the carnivores and their and the herbivores that are their prey coexist if there's only two of them? And then, does geology tell us that there was a flood that was worldwide? Or does it say that it was only within the known world, which would have been the Near East, the Middle East, and parts of North Africa? I mean, for example, they didn't know that Australia existed, and there are marsupials in Australia, in the Australian continent, kangaroos, wombats, um, why am I blanking? Tasmanian devils, wallabies is the one I was thinking. I was going to say willoughby, but that's a that's an episode of the Twilight Zone. These are marsupials, right? Duck-billed platypuses, things like this, like marsupials that are there. Well, there's no marsupials on the ark, so you know, there's these questions, and I actually kind of like these questions, that people ask, especially people that might consider themselves to be biblical or religious skeptics. They'll ask these questions. I think they're very good because they're not necessarily applying. When you apply skepticism, they're applying the greater sense of biblical criticism. One can still believe that these stories were allegorical, non literal, symbolic, metaphorical, and yet you can still believe in, if you want, in a God, or you can still be a Christian or Jewish or whatever. Like you can still have a religious affiliation and not take your scriptures literally because according to biblical criticism, it is a non-theological, it's a non-partisan, if you want to say, stance. So while some people will say, oh, because Noah's not true, it means God can't exist. But there's other people that say, but that's kind of, I think, short-sighted. It's not to say that they're wrong. It's just, to me, I feel that there's more meaning to these scriptures when they're criticized, and when we look at those academic pursuits and say, well, what were the people thinking about? Now, it's a little supposition, it's a little speculation we have to do on our part, but we have archaeology. We know these things. We can know certain things. We cannot know certain things. It's just, to me, a more fulfilling thing to say, like, hey, what's behind, you know, because it's like looking at a piece of paper and just reading the words literally and being like, wow, that's the meaning. Biblical criticism goes a little bit further, and you're thinking, what's the meaning behind this stuff? And yes, that is subjective. And yes, that will be determined sometimes by, individual life experience and stuff. But I just find it more fulfilling, in my opinion. And that's why I kind of like it. That's why I tell people we want to be a spiritual person, a religious person, a non-religious person. It's totally fine. It's up to you. You have, I am hoping everyone lives in a relatively free country where you have, religious freedom, and that includes the freedom from religion if that's what you want as well. But I think when it comes to this literalism, as we start getting into the more extreme versions, where, one if the Bible does say things literally, then there's a lot of things in like Deuteronomy, which is not great when it comes to slaves and women and you know what I mean? It's heavy stuff, and I've read Deuteronomy a number of times. I do want to also mention that sometimes when we think of as I said, the Bible, we might think of a Christian version of a Bible, which is totally fine. There's the Gideon's Bible, there's the King James Bible, there's something called the New International versions. There's also other versions. But in Judaism, we sort of have our own publication companies, and so I'm not going to say that there's that much of a difference between a Christian New Testament and let's say the King James Bible, or if you buy what's called the Tanakh from the Art Scroll Publication Company, which is Orthodox Jewish publication, like word for word, they're very similar. But then you do have to know that there might be different interpretations based upon those words, which again is totally fine too, because we have two different interpretations. And within that, we have more than two different interpretations because there are, again, there's the idea that, hey, um, there's this non-literal critique of what's going on, and then there's more literalistic. So anyway, that I find interesting too is even though the words themselves might be similar, the meaning and the commentary behind them. For example, in Christianity, a lot of scripture has been interpreted differently from priests in the Catholic Church down to theologians, to Protestants, to the Orthodox community, and so on. And of course, in Judaism, from rabbis in all the different denominations. And depending on the denomination one is in, um, it might be more liberal, it might be more conservative, or it might be just in the middle, and that's okay too. So really, that's just this kind of history, this kind of idea. And so the one thing that I always like to sort of spread around um, is the idea that if you do a little bit more research into the scientific revolution, it's a very, very interesting time, and it's a very, very important time when it comes to the history of religion. Because for two things I'll say on this. The first is when it specifically comes to religious observance during the Enlightenment, which overlaps with the scientific revolution. Um, the Enlightenment brought forth the idea of liberalism, which brought forth the separation between someone's public life and someone's private life. So before that, if you were a carpenter and you were Catholic, there was no separation. So if you were a carpenter and Catholic, you were a carpenter in a Catholic guild. If you were a stonemason and a Protestant, you were a stonemason in a Protestant guild, and so on. If you were Jewish and you were a merchant, you probably went to a particular synagogue. If you were Jewish and an artisan, you probably went to a particular synagogue. The Enlightenment, and again, that carried on also until, you know, late 19th, early 20th century. However, um, the identity was the same. The other thing is that during the scientific revolution, the idea of truth changed. So, truth before the scientific revolution was mostly subjective. It mostly had to do with art, poetry, music, feelings, which is what is called the Romantic school of art and stuff in like the early 19th century. They were trying to kind of get back to it was more emotional, and that was truth, right? It was experiential. It was based in an expression of art and so forth. But then the scientific revolution gave us things like rationalism and empiricism, where truth started to be what we saw. And of course, what we could observe, and especially science, natural sciences. The reaction to that is a biblical literalism. And a lot of these Protestant groups that rejected evolution, for example, because it wasn't mentioned in the Bible, or they held on to those stories like Noah's Ark because it was in the Bible and they couldn't accept that it wasn't a worldwide flood. And of course, the discovery of Australia and new species and new languages. You have the Tower of what would you call it, Babel or Babel? I can never remember. My Canadian accent says Babel. Some people laugh at me. They say, no, it's Babel. So you guys tell me if it's a strong A or an A. But like that has way more of a a metaphorical meaning because not only was there not probably a Tower of Babel, but like every language on earth does not have one common ancestor. Indo-European languages have a common ancestor, Proto-Indo-European. I speak Hungarian, that's a Uralic language. We have a Uralic common ancestor. The Hebrew and Arabic are called Afroasiatic languages. They have, you know, a common ancestor, but all languages of the world do not have one common ancestor. That, and if they did, um, certainly it hasn't been discovered, but it probably won't, because all of these proto languages, Proto Sino Tibetan, Proto Japonic, Proto Koreanic, Proto Tupian, Proto Indo European, Proto, they don't have anything in common within themselves. So again, just looking at those little things about truth and these reactions. I'm going to go to the start comments here. Irish Mart, you said, we were raised to treat the Bible as a collection of stories rather than my throat, of course, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between. Okay. Irish Mart says, we were raised to treat the Bible as a collection of stories rather than taking it literally, sort of illustrating a better way to live one's life. That is, I would say, a very mainline to liberal Christian attitude, whether that's Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. That's also very similar in the conservative Jewish movement and the Reform Jewish movement. So I tend to look at it that way. And another thing, of course, is you talk about this idea, which is very good, a series of collections. When most people sit and they read the Bible, they may read it cover to cover. It's very rare, but if you read it from cover to cover, it's like I always compare it to like I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan, and I have it. There's one volume of Sherlock Holmes's stories in one massive book. And I'm talking what, dozens and dozens of his stories in one book. Well, you can't read through the whole book because it's not one narrative. Every single, in this case, book of the Bible or chapter is one story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, which story structure in the ancient worlds is not like what we're used to today. Like, that's another thing about literary criticism. It's like we expect to go into a story like a movie, and especially a Hollywood movie. Something happens, right? There's an action, there's the um, inciting incident, there's the rising action, there's the denouement, there's the climax, and then there's the falling action. Like, that's a story structure that's very cultural. So you don't find that in Hindu scriptures or scriptures from the East. And if you're going into the Bible or whatever book, okay, and you're expecting a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you've got dozens and dozens of collections of stories, it's not going to make sense. And that's because the people who wrote it did not have us in mind. Is the Old Testament part of the Muslim religion too? I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Islam they will accept, like they're called an Abrahamic religion. They do believe Abraham, Moses, and Jesus were prophets, so they do accept parts of it. But from what I understand, they believe that the Quran is is a prophecy that, I guess you could say, corrected or progressed from certain things in the Old and New Testament. And then, of course, it's considered the last prophecy. Muhammad was considered the last and final prophet. So there's no prophets other than Muhammad. So I think he continued, or at least elaborated on the stuff in the Old and New Testament, took many of its characters and said that they were prophets, but that the final one is the Quran and is Muhammad. Is it true that there was no room for the unicorn on the ark? I actually don't know that story. Unicorn, yeah. I think that's actually something I think I remember on The Simpsons, because The Simpsons did a biblical stories thing, and I think they did an arc, and there's like some lonely unicorn who's sitting on the shore or something, and they're like, "Oh well, there's no room for you, Gary," or something like this. I love The Simpsons, but yeah, maybe. Uh, I'll let me answer, but I believe Muslims accept the Old and New Testament. Yes, but yes, exactly. You're 100%, Peter. They've added yeah, what you said it hit that on the head. So thank you, Peter. Number 4. Factor in translation errors. Yeah, exactly. You know, the Torah and the what we call the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible, which again you guys would call the Old Testament, was written in classical Hebrew. Then the New Testament Christian Bible was written, I think, in Greek. Then it was translated to Latin, and then obviously to German with Martin Luther, English with King James. So yeah, there's a lot of different translations and things like that as well. Considering that you had a Catholic, considering that you had Catholic monks copying the Bible, yeah, in their handwriting, and some even died before completing a copy of the Bible, would have another monk resume the work. That happens, yeah. And of course, we have Mark Apostle number 2, Joe Giuseppe, talked a little bit about Buddhism before. Well, I mentioned a little bit about it. It's good to see you, Joe. I'm glad that you are here. Number 2, number 2, Apostle number 2. Good to see you. Very much appreciated. Power lines to paralyze. Another one here. I'm going to put you somewhere on our rank. I'll have to figure that out where. I've got 4, so maybe you'll be number 5. But it's good to be good to see you and good to be with you here. One, the one common ancestor of all languages is clearly Esperanto. Okay, sure. Probably some hardcore Esperantists think that, right? Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, so yeah, so really, if you want to learn a little bit more, you could go on to Coffee Cults and Crafts, my last one that I did with Marilyn. I'll give a link of that when I do my time codes and do the subscriptions after we're done here. But really, it's just to sort of to take take a Bible story, take any Bible story, one you like, one that had some meaning for you, even one you don't like, and just basically think to yourself like, was this ever really intended to be literal, or was I taught that it should be literal by like a Sunday school teacher, a priest, a parent, someone? Because those individuals, again, are only learning it from a school of thought that's only a couple hundred years old. And what happens with when we learn something through education and things like this is often what we are taught first is has a very big impact on at least a big part of our lives. So, you get these horror stories of people who grew up in very insular religious communities, no matter what community they are. We see this all over very close knit, cut off, isolated communities, whether they're, Orthodox Jews or, Mormons or evangelical Christians or whatever. And then they go to university and they may have to take a science course and it like blows their mind when most of the people in the lecture hall are like, yeah, okay, okay. So yeah, the earth is not 6,000 years old. It wasn't created in 7 literal days, but that can be very devastating for people. And those people have my sympathy and my compassion. And they end up taking a 360 turn and might become very strongly anti-religious or critical. And it might really, really hurt them. They might, feel very traumatized because their parents didn't introduce them or their community wasn't open to things like evolution and religion are not the opposite of each other. Yes, there's young earth creationism, there's also old earth creationism. I'm not a believer in this, but most Orthodox Jews believe in old earth creationism. And that's the idea that, yeah, God created the world, so there isn't evolution, which is why I don't believe in it. But the 6 days were not literal. They might have been 6 billion years or something. Again, I don't agree with it, but at least they accept that the Earth is longer than 6,000 years. Um, I think evolution gets a bad rap. I think it has gotten a bad rap specifically because of the intelligent design people, and also because a lot of scientists who promote evolution tend to be atheists. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but there are also a lot of scientists that aren't, who also believe in evolution. Certainly, the Catholic Church has a hell of a lot of scientists. There's a lot of Vatican scientists, and they do believe in evolution. So I think perspective, I think how we were raised, education is definitely part of it. And I just think it's kind of tragic when um, you know, I can sympathize with people who grew up believing in one sort of singular narrative their whole life and are taught probably as children and as teenagers that doubt is bad. They can't doubt and all this kind of stuff. And then, yeah, they get an education, they see scientific information, and it's like, oh my God. And a lot of trauma stems from that too. And it's not, it's a mixture of things. But I think this is why, like, what my parents did, which was not force us to go to any religion. When I was 18, they supported, and again, they supported me in Scientology, which was not a good move. But the fact that they did and that they weren't critical meant that when I left, they were supportive. And so my parents, like all parents, and I don't know if anyone here is a parent or watching this, I'm sure, parents make mistakes. There's no guide or handbook or user manual to be a parent. I can imagine it being a very tough job. Um, but, at the same time, people do what they have to do, and healing can come from that as well. So I certainly sympathize with people who, again, grow up in a very strict biblical literalist community, and then it's sort of they open their eyes to these different things, so they might feel hurt or betrayed. Because kind of similarly, I mean, even though I was only in Scientology for 3 years, learning things about Scientology basically not being correct really devastated me as well. So you have my sympathy. But that is life. So in conclusion, to this today, to my stream, again, I want to apologize for being sick last week, having to cancel a little bit early. I mentioned at the top of our stream, and I'll go through some points again. But I caught a cold, which didn't seem that bad. I was stuffed up, a little coughing here and there, some sneezing. But last Saturday, last Sunday, I threw out my voice. I had complete laryngitis. I opened to talk, and nothing was kind of coming out. That went away by Wednesday. And so, yeah, I had to cancel. Just a heads up also for next week, I am planning to be out of town next Sunday. I will let you all know for sure if that happens. I'll let you know, probably by Friday, at least by Saturday, if that's going to happen. However, I am planning to do a stream this week, most likely midweek, probably Wednesday, Thursday. Again, I will let you know the exact date and time. But I am planning to do a stream and a live with Marilyn Honig of Coffee Cults and Crafts. I would like to do, for example, a stream, or we are going to do I hope, a multiple series, or at least a couple of videos on the history of Judaism and where Judaism kind of comes in and Christianity starts then. So for those that were here and know the video that I did on the Jewish ethnicities and ethnic divisions and denominations, we are going to get into that as well. So we're going to expand upon a lot of that stuff. So we're going to talk about, again, the history of Judaism, kind of how it's formed, going through Abraham, Moses, the first and second temple. We are going to go through again those sects, SECTS, of Judaism during the second temple, and then we're going to continue through the rabbinical period and so forth, and into the denominations and the ethnicities: Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, um, Reform, Reconstructionist, Humanist, Renewal, Conservative, Orthodox. And then we're going to also link into, because the first Pope, Peter, you guys call him St. Peter, his name was Simon, who was Jewish. And then I found out the other day by doing a little research that Pope number 5, and I forget what his name was born to a Jewish father. So there's been one and a half popes who were Jewish. Everyone else is pretty much Roman or French or German, Argentinian, Polish, etc. But at least one and a half have been Jewish, and I think that's actually kind of neat and kind of cool. So, black boots. As a child raised Protestant, it was all very confusing. There is Jesus with children. There is Jesus with children and a little lamb, right? And then there are the cowboys and Indians, and they all happen at the same time, right? Right. All of this biblical culture stuff is very interesting to me. Yeah, I think it is too. And I want to sort of make a statement here that it's funny how, again, how cultural it is. That's the one thing we have to understand about these things. Interpretations of religion is social based, it's cultural based. And so, like in the United States, you get this Bible Belt movement, this conservative Protestant evangelical movement, and they do exist in Latin America. It does exist in the UK, some parts of Europe, certainly throughout Africa. There are also evangelicals in Australia, New Zealand. There's a quiet amount of Christians in places like China, of course, in Pakistan, where Christians are persecuted, much like Jews, much like Muslims and everyone else. Depending on what country you're in, they'll probably persecute someone. But I find it fascinating that, like, in the United States, there's just such a large group of the literalism, and it's so big. And it's really not that big in other places. Like Canada has a Bible Belt. The Netherlands, by the way, has a Bible Belt. But like we don't hear about that. Like, the Bible Belt in Canada is between the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. We call them the prairies. But like in Canadian politics, we might have a conservative evangelical who might be running for the Conservative Party, but like it's kind of like we don't really hear that much. Like one of our former prime ministers named Stephen Harper was an evangelical Christian from Alberta, but like when he talked and stuff and spoke, like, did we know that? Like, no, there was a separation there. And I can imagine it's the same in other places. It seems to be this very um, convoluted or opportunistic, whatever the word you want to use, way of combining politics and religion in the United States, which I don't like. I don't think that's a controversial statement. Even amongst Christians, I don't think that's controversial. Certainly depends on what kind of Christian you are, but I do find it's kind of very American in a very large sense. Again, it's not the only place. There's a lot of places in the world that have state religions, not just Christian, but Muslim, also Buddhist. But it just seems to be because we're in the West. So a lot of eyes are always on the US. Those things tend to be elaborated, I think, a little bit more. And also for the sheer amount of people in the United States. I live in a country where there's not even 10 million people, and there's what, 340 million now in the US or 335, something like that's a lot of people. So, again, just perspective. But yeah, in the end, thank you all for listening. As I said, I'm going to hop off here. I'm going to add two links. One of the links to this channel will be my previous discussion with Marilyn on the origin of like biblical stories, and then of course I'll also add the link to the one we did that I did on like the Jewish ethnic divisions and denominations. After that, I'll get the time codes on. Want to thank everyone who popped on here. So let me just make sure I've got a good list here. So Peter came in, Mark Postle number 4. We have Irish Mark. Thank you, Mark Postle number 3. We had, of course, Joe, Mark Postle number 2. Power Lines, I think we're going to put you at number 5 if you would like. We also got Black Boots, so we'll think about that too. But I think you've been enough. It's been enough here that I think we'll call you Mark Postles. And remember, I will stop at 12. One of you will be Judas, so I'm sure we'll be Clearwater Chat. But again, apologies. Again, if I do go away for the weekend, I will let you all know. I will put a poll up, for something that we can talk about for the week after, but I still will be doing content, and I will still be doing content this week. So if you can catch it, please, refresh and come back here when you can to make sure that we have the right time, the right place, that you can come on and participate. Because I'm really, really looking forward to speaking with Marilyn again. She's fantastic, and I think you all will learn a lot. So hopefully, again, this was a great chat, and I look forward to doing more. So thank you again, everyone. And in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.